Oh my god, I'm tired. So most people are in agreement that last anime season was pretty fire. We had a new AOT and ReZero season, Mushoku Tensei started, and there was a lot of fantastic originals in their own right. But honestly, I think this season might be able to top it. I started this video with the assumption that there'd be 5, maybe 6 anime that I could recommend, but I ended up watching 12 different anime, and I'm having a hard time deciding which to continue to watch. But anyway, let's skip the nonsense and get right into it. I'll be starting with the weakest anime and working up to my favorite. And without further ado, I've been killing slimes for 300 years and I've maxed out my level. I'll give you 3 guesses as to what this anime is about. This is probably where you expect me to start complaining about isekai and how much I don't like it, and how it's an excuse for bad world building and yada yada. At this point, I'm not really too upset about isekai as long as they aren't trying to take themselves too seriously. And that's the kind of feel I get from killing slimes. Like the anime, I didn't actually kill slimes. Normally, the slice of life isekai get a quick drop halfway through the first episode, but the writing and style of killing slimes was just brisk enough that I was able to make it through the first episode, which honestly surprised me. That being said, there really isn't any reason for me to continue watching any more episodes of this. It's almost exactly the same as A Boy from the Last Dungeon's Boonies from last season, and a million other OP MC comedy isekai. It doesn't make me physically sick to watch like smartphone isekai, but you're better off just watching Konosuba or something. If you're the type to enjoy a lighthearted anime like this running in the background, I might be able to suggest it. Otherwise, you're not missing anything by skipping. I've been killing slimes for over 300 years and I've maxed out my level. Episode 1 gets a 5 out of 10. Next up is The World Ends With You, the animation. Oh man. This one hurt, boys and girls. The World Ends With You, and I'm gonna call it Twee-wee for the rest of the episode so I don't tire my tongue out, is tied for my favorite game of all time. It's the very definition of a hidden gem. A niche, poorly advertised little game on the DS is such a unique flash of brilliance that it boggles my mind that it never went mainstream. Besides a unique urban fantasy storyline based around the aesthetic of modern Tokyo, the soundtrack employed in this little mobile JRPG is second to none. I could gush over the game for this whole section, but that's not the point here. The point is that Twee-wee the animation isn't good. I'm extraordinarily impressed that they managed to port the art style over to full animation flawlessly. But frankly, that's the only good thing I can say about this anime. How it looks. Imagine you're watching a playthrough of the game, but cut everything except for cutscenes and boss battles, then cut about 60% of the dialogue. That's The World Ends With You, the animation. I know that you can't just include everything in a 12-episode anime, but it's not like you have to be literally nothing but a condensed synopsis of the game. I watched the first episode with a group of friends and most of them could not tell me what was going on. Second, all of the fight scenes basically look the same. Neku and Shiki spinning around the monster while throwing some fire and occasionally lightning. Don't get me wrong, in isolation this looks fantastic, some of the best use of CG in anime, but it's just the same gimmick over and over again. Overall, my take on Twee-wee the animation is that they really should have just taken all of this work and re-released the game with full motion cutscenes. I'm not gonna say I'm upset or anything, I really should have expected this, as JRPG adaptations are rarely good by their own nature, but I guess I wanted this to be different. Luckily, people I watched this with said they were interested in playing the game, and we just got a trailer for the new sequel. Twee-wee Episode 1 gets a 5.5 out of 10. Not mad, just disappointed. Next up is the Shaman King reboot. So I'll be coming at this with the perspective of someone who only watched like 1 or 2 episodes of the 4Kids dub back in the day. In my opinion, the idea of a big name shonen getting modern day remakes with actual effort is certainly appealing. Full Metal Alchemist remake was so successful that it's often called the best anime of all time. And Shaman King was more or less forgot about as it was drowned out by the birth of the big 3 during the early 2000s. So I think it's fantastic that it's getting a new lease on life. To summarize this 20-year-old series quickly, Yo is a young shaman who has the ability to converse with spirits. Once every 500 years, shamans gather to become Shaman King, one who can contact the Great Spirit and subsequently obtain godlike powers. As you can probably tell, it certainly has a simple premise of a late 90s shonen. To start, the anime looks great. Nowadays, you can make pretty much any adaptation look amazing with a little bit of cell animation, but I really feel like they adapted the old art style fantastically here. As for everything else, it's difficult to critique as the plot has existed for over 2 decades and might not be worthy of the same critique as something newer. Now, I said that the art style looks great in this adaptation, but the animation not so much. The sharp lines and modern color palette may hide it well, but the actual movement is arguably worse than the original. Yo's infusion with Amidamaru, perhaps what should be the most hype part of the episode, looked like the same 2 or 3 cells repeated over and over again. During the fight scene at the end of the episode, Yo's various sword slashes contained literally 0 frames of animation at times. Additionally, Shaman King is just too quiet. 90% 80% of the episode was actually just dead silent, making solitary dialogue just feel wrong. The track during the fight scene didn't feel all that inspired, and overall it didn't do a good job of pulling me in. I understand that Shaman King is a classic, but the standards of shonen nowadays are just too high for something like this to stand up to its competition. If I was gonna give Shaman King a chance, I think I would just read the manga at this point. I know that this rating is really going to upset some people, but I beg you to just go back and rewatch the fight scene to see what I mean. Shaman King Remake Episode 1 gets a 5.5 out of 10. Next up is Pretty Boys Detective Club. Oh boy, here we go. So, Bishonen Tantedan is the newest series from Monogatari writer Nisio Isin. And if you know anything about me, you know I'm not a fan of that series. Look, I recognize that it's a very unique form of writing, and there's certainly some interesting philosophy to glean from the series, but I always felt as if it obfuscates that philosophy in layers of incoherence and layers of irony that make it more of a chore to analyze rather than a stimulating activity. Additionally, a lot of the known quality of the Monogatari series is from the absolutely fantastic animation of its adaptation, rather than the writing itself. I'm typically one to agree with the mainstream about the general quality of a series, but Monogatari is one that I never can understand. So what about Pretty Boys Detective Club? Well, it's pretty much the same thing, but with boys instead of girls. The premise is exactly what the title says. It's a detective club full of bishonen or pretty boys. No doubt that the animation quality rivals that of Monogatari, but it was made rather clear in the first episode that if you aren't a fan of the shotgun writing style of that, then you probably won't be a fan of this. It's extremely clear that Shaft is trying to replicate Monogatari's success with not only the colors, but the editing, storyboarding, and the overall style of Pretty Boys Detective Club. The extremely short-lived frames, the sudden close-up, the endless cryptic monologues, each joined by our characters from different angles, different lightings, and different positions, is all here. Hell, one of the characters looks almost exactly like Araragi with a red color swap. I really don't have much more to say about this anime because whether or not you enjoy it is wholly dependent on whether or not you're a fan of the anime it's clearly replicating. As I've said multiple times in the past, replicating past success is not a bad thing if it works, but it does constrain the enjoyment of an anime down to if you enjoyed the original piece. Just because of that, I'm gonna hold off on the rating of this just because it's not for me. Next up, we got Eden Zero. Alright, so another one of the super hyped anime of the season. I was never a big fan of Fairy Tail. Like, I didn't think it was bad at all, it just had very little uniqueness to it, and went really overboard with the shonen tropes at times. That being said, Hiro Mashima certainly has a writing talent, so it's worth getting excited for whatever he has coming. Eden Zero's two main characters look virtually identical to their Fairy Tail counterparts, with slightly different motivations. Shiki is a young boy raised by non-humans on a lonely planet, with the one and only goal of making as many friends as possible. Then there's Rebecca, whose goal is to get 1 million followers on her YouTube channel. So yeah, we have a spice of something in this anime that has potential to be different. To be clear, I actually think the idea of pals traversing the universe trying to become viral influencers is a pretty cool idea, but I'm fairly certain it won't remain that way. Again though, I haven't read the manga. The first episode simply features Rebecca stumbling onto Shiki while filming a video on his home planet, and subsequently taking him out into the stars. Watching this anime, I definitely got the vibe from the writing and pacing that Eden Zero is going to be pretty much just Fairy Tail in space. I would really like to talk a little more about this anime, but we really didn't learn much of anything about anyone in this episode, besides the basics of who Rebecca and Shiki are. The animation in the singular fight scene was not all that great. Although if the anime plans to be non-seasonal, I suppose that makes sense. All that being said, I think I'm going to have to wait to see more before I decide if I want to pick this up. Eden Zero Episode 1 gets a 6 out of 10. Next, we have Don't Toy With Me, Miss Nagataro. If you spent any amount of time on Twitter in the past couple months, then you probably already know what this anime is. It's been the subject of criticism because of its rather questionable premise. The main character is Naoto, a timid introvert who finds himself unable to express himself to other people. Basically, he's the victim of bullying to the point of turtling up and shutting himself off to the world. He's discovered by a girl named Nagataro who feels that the solution to his bullying problem is extreme bullying? I don't know. There's a bit of a controversy about whether bullying is the correct translation of the title versus messing with, but I think the intent is rather clear. I'll admit it's certainly an enjoyable watch even if the premise found itself played out in just a single episode. We see Naoto get close to a breakthrough in self-confidence, then Nagataro shuts him down again and again and again. There's this whole sequence of him finally working up the courage to look directly at her and create an entire sketch of her body. When it looks like he's been successful, Nagataro calls him a creep and a virgin loser because he didn't outline her thighs. Setting aside the people who like this show for other reasons, I can admit that the writing is brisk and the different situations are rather humorous. But I hope that Naoto is given a few wins and isn't just relentlessly put down until he develops some sort of Stockholm syndrome. As I've said before, I'm not the biggest aficionado of slice of life or romantic comedy. As someone who's not read the manga for this series, I actually don't know which it's supposed to be. But I can see this entire setup becoming kind of played out. Reiterating, however, the writing is good. The humor is good. It's just that the comedies based on a single joke tend to get stale rather quickly. The internet seems absolutely in love with this manga, so I'm certainly giving it the benefit of the doubt. Don't Toy With Me, Miss Nagataro episode 1 gets a 6.5 out of 10. Next is Odd Taxi. Have you heard about this anime? Well, neither have I. This was another random anime I watched with friends the other day and I'm quite blown away. The best way to describe this anime would be Beastars, except even more adult. It stars Odokawa, a walrus whose profession as a taxi driver in a city of animals leads him to discover some pretty interesting characters. The plot gets kicked into motion when Odokawa finds himself taking a selfie with a social media obsessed animal and, well, I don't want to spoil what happens, but I can tell that this whole series is going to be one to follow. For one, Odokawa strikes me as a far more cynical Legoshi, still wanting to avoid what gets thrust upon him, but he's a far more chatty and analytical to the world around him. And I know what you're saying, Akazura, are you just saying that it's like Beastars because it's a world full of animals? No, I'm not. It seems to be the fact that anime like Beastars, Agretsuko, or Odd Taxi all seem to be interesting commentaries on human society. It's very possible that Odd Taxi is trying to ride the wave of success like Beastars. Many of its plot elements are very similar, but overall it has its own vibe that made it an intriguing episode. Odd Taxi is definitely one of this season's hidden gems, and the first episode gets a 7 out of 10. Next is I Shaved Then Brought a High School Girl Home. What the hell is this? Alright, let's get the summary out of the way. Office worker Yoshida gets drunk one night after getting rejected by his crush. On his way home, he meets a young teenage girl who offers to sleep with him in exchange for a place to stay the night. Thankfully, Yoshida refuses and just has her stay over for free. But this girl continues to try and seduce Yoshida for some reason. Look, I know that anime in the right hands can tackle taboo subjects like this, but honestly, I just couldn't help but get creeped out by parts of I Shave. If this anime was focused more on whether trauma made this girl desperate to sleep with an older man, it wouldn't be as bad. But this anime plays fun music and makes lighthearted conversation about this girl's breasts as if it wasn't a traumatized girl begging to be groomed. That being said, the writing in this episode was honestly quite good and did a decent job of making up for the weirdness of the beginning. With anime mostly turning teenage life into a literal escapist fantasy, it's good to see a show approaching the less glamorous sides of teenage life, such as the problem of runaways. All cultures, including Japanese cultures, have problems with young people allowing themselves to be taken advantage of for basic necessities. So an anime that focuses on these issues is definitely welcome. However, I still feel as if this anime was a bit confused as to what tone it wanted to take on the whole issue. I know that just filling the episode with pain and suffering for 22 minutes straight wouldn't make for good pacing, but the joviality of it all made it a bit difficult to become invested in what she was going through. Overall, it's a rather intriguing adult drama series in a world severely lacking in them. But to stick with it, I'm going to need a better idea of what exactly this anime actually is. I Shaved So I Brought Home a Teenage Girl episode 1 gets a 7 out of 10. Next up is none other than To Your Eternity. People have been telling me for years to read To Your Eternity, but I just haven't gotten around to it. Most people are very quick to point out that the mangaka Yoshitoki Oima is also the writer behind The Silent Voice. And that's certainly true, but it's worth noting that he also wrote Marduk Scramble, which is good, but it wasn't anywhere near the legendary status of The Silent Voice. The point being that just because a mangaka has skill in one genre doesn't always mean it translates to others. So how does To Your Eternity fare? To Your Eternity is essentially about the journeys of an unnamed immortal being and the various forms he takes in the people that he meets. The first episode follows our main character as he meets a young boy in a snowy tundra, desperately trying to make his way to civilization. And as you can imagine from this author, it doesn't go well. The entire experience of just this one episode was gut-wrenching for sure, but I wasn't entirely pulled into the emotion of this relationship, mostly given that this boy was only alive for 20 minutes. But I don't necessarily believe that was the point, however, and instead was a fantastic way to explain the coldness that is this being's existence. In order to take a new form and carry on its existence, it needs stimulation, and in this case, it was the life of this young boy. It was an absolutely beautiful piece of writing that feels so rare for anime outside of large cinematic projects like, I don't know, The silent voice? I will say that the animation is not great. I'm not completely sure how important animation is going to be for a slower series like To Your Eternity, but there were times where I did feel taken out of the story just because of the cheapness of some of the shots. It's a tad disappointing considering what KyoAni's hard work did for the silent voice, but overall, I don't expect it to be too much of a hit for this upcoming classic. To Your Eternity Episode 1 gets a 7.5 out of 10. Next, we got Tokyo Revengers. So you've probably seen this premise before. Takemichi is a total loser. He lives in a rundown apartment. He's treated like trash from his boss who's younger, he's bullied by elementary school kids, and of course he's still a virgin. One day, he's watching TV only to find out that his middle school girlfriend, the only girlfriend he's ever had, was murdered. He begins to wonder what exactly happened that caused him to peak when he was young. Then, as per tradition, Takemichi is pushed onto the train tracks and wakes up in the body of his old self. It turns out that Takemichi's life turned to shit when he bowed down to the Tokyo Manji gang that made him and his crew their slaves. Even worse so, they were the ones to kill his girlfriend all those years later. Tokyo Revengers feels very much like an urban ReZero, with the main character resolving to fix what went wrong. To be honest, I'm a huge sucker for these types of tales. I know that time travel is considered an overdone concept in anime, and all media for that matter, but I really do feel like it's a great plot mechanic for connecting the consequences of a character's actions. I always enjoy games like Chrono Trigger and Ocarina of Time when you get to see how your small actions can affect the future immediately. That thought aside, Tokyo Revengers does a fantastic job at getting you to root for Takemichi's success as soon as possible, even if his success is basically becoming a hardened gangster and a delinquent. I did feel a little annoyed at the shifts in pacing in this episode, with the quick shifts between breakthroughs for the character and slower exposition. Second, I do wonder if the idea of Takemichi jumping back and forth throughout time, rather than sticking with the past and learning how to improve himself, would have told a better story. It's probably easier and more thrilling to exploit the time travel mechanic by giving the opportunity to see the immediate results of his actions, but to me this is at the expense of deeper character development. But these little quirks don't take away from how well this anime hooks you into the core concept. I'm really excited to see how Takemichi can go about changing things, so Tokyo Revengers Episode 1 gets a 7.5 out of 10. Next up is Vivy's Fluorite's Eye Song. Vivy's Fluorite's Eye Song was the anime I was most looking forward to this season. It stars Vivy, a songstress AI that has been given a singular purpose: sing and make people happy. Everything changes when she's visited by an AI from the future that declares that in just 100 years, AI will commit mass genocide against all humans. From there, the two work together to start undoing chains of events that led to this tragedy. There are two main factors into my hype for this anime. First, it's the newest project from Studio Wit of Attack on Titan fame. It might be a little presumptuous to say, but I feel as if Wit has the largest hand in the sudden renaissance of animation from the TV anime space. One thing that Wit does that I see get overlooked is the use of dramatic angles in order to add a cinematic look to anime, such as the legendary Levi vs Beast Titan fight. And while Vivy isn't nearly as visceral as Attack on Titan, Wit was able to add quite a bit of its signature flair with many of the action scenes that outline Vivy. Second, Vivy is written by ReZero author Teppei Nagatsuki, who is quite known for his heavy use of cliffhangers, suspense, and plot twists. And in only 2 episodes, Teppei has certainly demonstrated his talent in this anime. Vivy is a relatively small-scale anime, with most of it taking place only in the AI theme part titular to its setting, but Teppei is able to keep the viewer constantly on their toes with the sudden twists and revelations that force both Vivy and us to think on our feet. If I had to levy any criticism against this anime, it would be ironically just how breakneck the pacing is. Giant reveals about the future and sudden shifts in the tone of particular scenes can happen so quickly that I found myself having to back up more than a handful of times just to make sure I process everything that happened. All that being said, Vivy has lived up to the hype that I expected for it, and I absolutely look forward to where it goes from here. Vivy's Fluorite's Eye Song started with the 2-parters, so episode 1 and 2 gets a 8 out of 10. And finally, 86. Wow, this one took me by surprise. I had been told by quite a lot of people that this anime was going to be for me, but when I looked at its synopsis, I initially thought that it was going to be one of those mecha military dramas that tries a little too hard. Fuck was I wrong. 86 is about the conflict between the Giadian Empire and the Sang Magnolia Republic, the country which we follow. The Giadian Empire was able to invent autonomous mechas to fight proxy wars for them. And in an effort to combat this advantage, Sang Magnolia invented the Juggernauts, unmanned mechas of their their own. But it turns out that they are only technically unmanned, as the actual pilots are called the 86, a minority within the country that's considered subhuman. Our main character Mirase is directed to command one of these 86 squadrons called Spearhead, known for driving its handlers to suicide. It's such a simple concept, but the execution is done flawlessly. Many anime with such a setting spend the entire episode explaining its world through exposition. But 86 employs the show don't tell strategy that all writers are told in 3rd grade, but seem to forget as soon as they put pen to paper. I especially like the way this anime was split between showing us the safe and posh republic, juxtaposed with the slummy barracks of the 86s. Putting this fantastic world building aside, this entire anime strikes me as an enigma, as it doesn't seem to have a star director or studio behind it. Despite this, every single frame seems to be meticulously designed to draw the viewer into the war zone of which it takes place. But more immersive is actually the sound design. Most anime mix down sound effects such as explosions or other signs of war, but 86 feels as if it's deliberately trying to shock the audience with sudden transitions, jarring changes in volume, and other out-of-place sound effects that drive home the war is hell message. This first episode was so good, I actually ended up watching it twice just to see what I had missed, something I have almost never done with any other anime. While it just barely beats out Vivy, I think that I'm confident enough to call 86 my favorite anime of the season thus far. 86 episode 1 gets an 8.5 out of 10. And there we go. I'm sure there's a number of good series that I may have missed, but honestly, I'm too tired to care. Anyway, if you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe. I need the dopamine hit to recover from this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.